Hi everyone. I'm going to tell all of you today to stop using JavaScript forever, to use CSS and HTML instead. No, just kidding. But I am going to tell you about a ton of features you can now use CSS and HTML for that used to need JavaScript. First, a little bit about me. I'm Kilian. I've spent the past 20 years building websites, but nowadays I no longer build websites. I build a browser called Polypane. Polypane is a browser for all of you. It's a browser for developers. It really helps with responsive design, accessibility, and overall website quality. This presentation is done in Polypane, but I won't be speaking about that very much during the presentation. So if you want to learn more, come talk to me after. And Polypane is built in Electron. Electron is a JavaScript framework that combines Node and Chromium to create desktop applications. So I'm actually very much team JavaScript. I write JavaScript the vast majority of the day. For Electron, I'm also part of the Electron governance team, so I help out with documentation, new releases, etc. So I love JavaScript. I write it every day. I very much enjoy it. But I also love CSS. And I even love HTML. I mean, HTML, right? Yeah, I love HTML. And I love JavaScript, CSS, and HTML because of the rule of least power. Now, the rule of least power is one of the core principles of web development, and essentially means that you should use the least powerful language to do what you need to do. It means preferring HTML over CSS over JavaScript. Because your JavaScript can break and then stuff won't work. It can fail to download and then stuff won't work. It can do things that your browser doesn't understand, then it doesn't work. Whereas CSS and HTML are languages that are declarative. And that means that instead of telling the browser what to do, which is what you do with JavaScript, you more or less suggest it. You say, browser, please draw a box with a red border. And if your browser doesn't understand that, it's still going to try to make things right. Oh, the border might not be red, but it might be black or whatever. So browsers do a much better job of interpreting and dealing with your CSS and HTML than with your JavaScript. And that means that even if your CSS doesn't work, your HTML will still be parsed, and if you write good HTML, then it probably will still be readable to your end user. And in recent times, browser makers have really started listening to what developers need. Both browser makers and spec writers are looking to the stuff we do in JavaScript with hundreds and hundreds of lines of code and figuring out what they can do to make that possible in HTML and CSS natively in the browser. So a lot of stuff that a few years ago needed JavaScript no longer needs JavaScript. And that's what we'll be discussing today. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind of features. I'm just going to name a bunch of stuff. Some of these you might know. Some of these might be new. There's going to be a bunch of demos, so stuff might break. You can laugh if that happens, it's okay. So let's get started with custom toggles. So when implementing custom toggles, we often reach for a JavaScript solution that draws the nice toggle and it keeps track of the state, and there's events, etc., etc. But we can do the same with an ordinary checkbox and the checked pseudostate in CSS. So that means we can have fully interactive toggles using just CSS and native browser APIs. And that's really nice because it means that all the accessibility features that a browser gives a checkbox are still preserved, and you don't have to write them yourself. So here's how we're going to do that. This is the HTML we're going to use. And as you can see, it's pretty simple. There's a label. The label has a name, my awesome feature. And inside the label is a checkbox. Now, the neat thing about having the input inside the label is that the browser already knows that they're associated. And that means that I can click the entire label and the input will get toggled. This is something the browser gives us for free. It's not, you don't have to add an on-click handler to the label. It just works. So that's already one thing you don't have to implement. But checkboxes don't look great, right? They kind of look ugly. So we need to change that. We're going to style the input to look like a toggle. There's a whole bunch of CSS on screen. And now it looks like a toggle. But there's one thing I want to call out, and that's the top line over there. Appearance, none. Inputs, by default, like images, are something called replaced content. And that means that the browser doesn't really render your HTML there, but it replaces it with a native form element, like an input, or it renders the image more or less on top of your web page. It replaces the content. And while that's nice, it means that the browser manages that for you, it also has some downsides. Primary downside is that replaced content can't have pseudo elements like before and after. Because if you add a before and after to an element, they live inside the element. And if you then have the browser replace the entire element, your pseudo elements are gone. So that's not great. We want to use that before element to create the little white nib there in the middle. By setting appearance to none, you essentially tell the browser, you know, please don't replace my content. I'm going to take care of it myself. And that means that this beautiful toggle is still just an input. Like, I can click it and, well, nothing happens, but the state of that toggle is now checked. And that's great. The browser already keeps track of the state of it being checked or not. Of course, we want to show that to the user, so let's do that. And to make that change visible, we can use the checked pseudo class. This will match whenever the input is, well, you guessed it, checked. So now as I check, you can see that the background is now green, and I'm doing a tiny little transform to move the nib from the left to the right. And as you click back and forth, what's really happening is that the browser is checking and unchecking the input, and we're just listening to that, call it an event, with the checked pseudo class. And that way we get a beautiful toggle. Now, there's a few additional things we want to do, because the toggle is great if you click it, but what you're probably used to doing with inputs is that top line over there called outline none. Because if you don't, the browser renders this ugly yellow thing around your input. You definitely don't want that. Except you do, because that ugly outline is a focus ring, and that focus ring is very important for people that don't use a mouse. If you use a mouse, it's very easy to figure out what you're clicking, because you have your mouse and you're clicking. But if you don't use a mouse, if you use a keyboard or anything else, then you more or less have to guess where on the page you are. So you definitely don't want to do that. But again, if you do know where you're clicking, then you probably don't need that extra outline. Well, browsers have a solution for this as well. It's called Focus Visible. What Focus Visible does is it draws that outline, or it lets you listen to the events where you do want the outline. So as I, where's my mouse? There's my mouse. As I click, nothing happens. But now if I switch from using a mouse to using a keyboard with the spacebar, a nice focus ring gets added. So people using a keyboard now also have a good idea of where they are on the page. Now, that's something you want to add, but you can see that where there's outline none, I wrote no above it, because I don't want you to do that. I want you to write outline color transparent instead. The effect, the result will be the same. There's no outline. In one situation it's hidden, in the other situation it's transparent. You don't see it, that's the point. But if you write outline none, it will never be there. If you write outline color transparent, then when people using forced color mode or Windows high contrast mode will get an outline, because Windows high contrast mode overrides all the colors on your screen to something your user wants. And when people use Windows high contrast mode, usually they prefer higher contrast. So a focus outline is actually really helpful for them to figure out where on the page they are, even if they're using a mouse. By setting outline color to none or outline color to transparent, what happens is that that color will get replaced with a border color that they chose. So you instantly get a more accessible website, even if when using your mouse, it's still just as beautiful as your designer wants it to be. So I don't have time to go into forced color mode or Windows high contrast mode much more, but I wrote a very large article at polypaint.app/forced-colors that you can check out. If you're not familiar with it, with forced colors, go give it a read. It will be helpful. So that's how you create a fancy toggle without a single line of JavaScript. And if you want to try it out, there's a URL over there. Now, while we're working on forms, let's do a couple of quick ones. Have you heard of data list? So data list is the browser's built-in way of offering auto-suggestions to inputs. It works like this. You have a data list with a list of options, and you give it an ID so you can refer it elsewhere. And then for any input, you just add list is frameworks or whatever your chosen ID is. And now the input is automatically upgraded to have auto-suggestions. No code needed, no cleverness needed. It's just a list. So I can type, till, and it will suggest tailwind for me. I can select it, and it will write it out for me. But I can also click the drop-down. It will list all the options for me. I can even start somewhere in the middle, and it'll still suggest stuff for me. Now, that's great because it's just a regular input. There's no JavaScript listeners you have to add. The input still lets people write in their own stuff if they want. So it has all these features that you want in an Autosuggest, but it's just plain HTML. Another nice one is input type color. Instead of shipping a JavaScript color picker that's thousands of lines of code and it draws a little canvas and the user can drag, and accessibility of it may be questionable, you don't know, you can let the browser handle it. You can just write input type color, and you get a very nice color picker. You can even pick any color on the screen, and that'll work too. You get that for free. The browser includes it. And that's not something your JavaScript color picker can do. So one thing I want to note here as well is that this is an unstyled input. And you're used to unstyled inputs being kind of ugly, but also very white. It doesn't have to be. Of course, you can style them, but that's kind of limited. You can also let the browser handle it, and that's what Color Scheme Dark does for you. With Color Scheme Dark, you essentially tell the browser, you know, this element, or even this entire page, is really a dark mode page. And please, if you replace content, like an input, make sure that it matches. And then the browser does it for you. It creates a dark border or a dark background, make sure that the foreground color has enough contrast. It handles everything for you. Now, if you have both a light and a dark mode, you definitely don't want to write Color Scheme Dark and then overwrite it with Color Scheme Light. You can also let the browser handle that. You can just write Color Scheme Light space dark, and then the browser will listen to your preferred color scheme to decide whether or not to use dark or light inputs. So, two small things, onto something a little bigger. What about like complex page transitions? Like when moving from one part of a page to another part of the page, what usually happens is that it happens in an instance. But that's not very nice. Usually you want the browser and the page to nicely scroll to the next section. It's easier on the eyes for users, and it also helps them more or less understand where they are on the page. Like how far down did I scroll or how far back up. So back in the day, you probably used jQuery for that. You listened to, or you added a listener to all the links. Then when you click it, you figure out where the link goes, and you call animate on HTML. And that's great. I mean, we owe a ton to jQuery. And this is not that many lines of code, so that's pretty, you know, it's okay. Except that jQuery, of course, is also hundreds and hundreds of lines of code. So we can achieve the same thing with just a single line of CSS. Scroll behavior smooth tells the browser to always scroll smoothly when navigating to a fragment identifier, which is the thing with a hash in front of it. Now, with this line, every link is magically upgraded. I can click it, and it'll scroll down for me. Now, the browser will figure out where to scroll, how long that takes, the easing curve. It will take care of all of that and make sure that it's still a pretty good experience, even if you scroll like 20 pages or 20 pixels. So that means the animation is always snappy. Whereas if you were to implement this in JavaScript with a request animation frame, it might not always be so smooth. Browser will make it smooth for you. Of course, you can also use this in JavaScript, so you don't have to give up JavaScript completely. All the scroll to functions in JavaScript can take an object with the offset where to scroll to, like top, left, and a behavior. And if you set that behavior to smooth, then you get smooth scrolling in JavaScript as well. So that's great, but I have one more thing to add, that's accessibility. So while for most people, having that smooth scrolling is nicer than snapping to another part of the page, for people with vestibular disorders, that scrolling is the thing that's annoying, that can make them nauseous and unwell. Now, browsers have a way of catering to these users with the prefers reduce motion media query. The way to implement this is to have that accessible experience by default. So no smooth scrolling by default. And only when you detect that there's no preference for reduced motion, you add the smooth scrolling. Now this has two benefits. Everyone that uses a modern browser and prefers scrolling gets the nice scrolling, but people that use a modern browser and don't prefer scrolling don't get it, so that's good. But also people using older browsers, which a lot of people using assistive technologies do, then they still get the more accessible experience. if a browser doesn't understand the prefers reduced motion media query. So think about that. Make the default experience the accessible experience. So now we have native smooth scrolling for the people that want that. We have no smooth scrolling for those that don't. And we're not shipping any JavaScript. So that's a great start, but we can do a little more with the browser. What if we want to scroll to an element, but we need to leave a little room at the top? For example, because we have a very beautiful fixed header. If you just scroll to the top, then it'll scroll all the way behind that header. So that's not great. You can use JavaScript to calculate the offset and the height of the header and then subtract that. But let's not do that. Let's just let CSS handle it using scroll margin top. So scroll margin works the same as regular margin, except only when scrolling. So if I now say, let's go to target, you can see that my target ended nicely below the header instead of behind the header. And just to prove you that I'm not cheating, this one doesn't have a scroll margin, and it ends up behind the header. Not great. So that's how easy it is in CSS. But we can do even more. What, as a finishing touch, we want to scroll a user to a section of the page while keeping a little bit of headroom, but then also let people know, like, this is the thing we want you to look at. We want to animate whatever we're scrolling to. We could use JavaScript to add a class to that element and then have like a nice CSS animation. But there's a CSS solution for that too, called the target pseudo class. So the target pseudo class will match whenever that element is linked as the fragment identifier. So if I now click to target, that link will go to my target. The fragment identifier will match. That will cause the CSS to work. And you get this beautiful highlight of the title. So now we've built a way to scroll smoothly to a section of the page. We highlight it so that people know, okay, we've actually landed here. I want you to look at my middle title. And we always keep some space for the header to make sure that people aren't confused, like why am I looking at something, why do I have to scroll back? So all without CSS. Now, in the previous couple of demos, you saw a header that was fixed with position fixed. But position fixed is actually quite difficult to work with because it takes the elements outside of their parent elements and it's always stuck to the viewport. And you can only size it in comparison to that viewport. It doesn't really know about the rest of the page, and it's pretty annoying. That's very often not quite what you want. Now, what if there's an element you want to keep in view, like fixed some of the time, but not all of the time? You want to like fit with the rest of the page, with their parent elements. Well, that's what sticky positioning lets you do. So now if I scroll these two, I get a box that's sticky, and another box that's sticky, and you can see that top 50%. That top 50% isn't 50% from the viewport, or actually it is 50% from the viewport, but until it hits that edge, that border, it will just stay relative to the parent element. And if I scroll further down, as soon as the parent element starts to move away beyond that edge, it just takes the element with it. Boom, gone. Now, of course, you can do this with JavaScript very easily. You just download the in-view package from NPM, which is I don't know how many lines of CSS or JavaScript. And you add it and you make it work, but you know, bunch of JavaScript, single line of CSS. and browser optimized. So the browser will take care of keeping it sticky instead of you having to figure out the position of the element when it's about to get sticky, then setting the new styling, and keeping track of all of that. So consider sticky. On to another staple of JavaScript libraries, carousels, or sliders, or whatever you want to call them. Images that go one by one that you want to keep track of. And CSS has a solution for that too, called scroll snap. Now, with scroll snap, we can create sliders that snap their images or their elements to their parent. You need 2 lines of CSS for that. You need to tell the parent what to do, and you need to tell the children, the child elements, what to do. For the parent, you first have to tell it that it has a scroll snap type. It can be X for horizontal or Y for vertical. And then you tell it how to snap. There's 2 values there. Mandatory, which means always snap, and proximity, which is snap if it's close enough to the edge. What edge? Well, that's what you tell the child elements with scroll snap align. Scroll snap align means you decide whether to snap to the left side edge with start in left to right languages anyway, end or center. So here's what that looks like. I can scroll like I usually do. It's all very smooth, it's all native scrolling, just direct input. But as soon as I release, the browser will figure out which elements it should snap to. So you always get a nicely aligned slider. But you can do more with it. So right now I have a slider that's slightly wider and you can see multiple images, pretend they're images. And I can tell it to say scroll snap align center. Now all of these will snap to the center, unless they can't. But notice how none of these images are the same width, and the browser still does all the calculation for you. Imagine doing this in JavaScript. You need to take the width of the parent element and then halve it, and then take the width of the current selected slide that's more or less in the middle, and then do a bunch more math. Let the browser handle it. It's very good at math. I'm not. The browser is. And it just takes care of everything for you. Now, there's a whole range of very cool tricks you can do with scroll snapping, like different types of animations, over-scrolling effects like on iOS, and other things that I don't have time for, but Adam does, and he has a full hour of scroll snap tricks that you can check out. I'll wait for the cameras. Okay, on to something slightly smaller again. Scroll snapping was pretty big. Let's do a couple of small ones. Lazy loading. Instead of importing a JavaScript library that keeps track of where the image is on the screen or on the page, and then as it scrolls close enough to the viewport, quickly switch data source to load the image, yada, yada, yada. You can just add loading lazy to an image. And now your image is magically upgraded, and the browser will decide for you when the best time to load this image is. That means your page will load faster, and your users will be happier. Now, what if you have to link to a PDF? Because marketing has PDFs, and they want you to link to them. But you don't want them to open in a window. You don't want that PDF viewer. You just want the PDF to be downloaded. Well, you add the download attribute. It tells the browser this is a resource that I want you to download. Don't try to open it, just download it, let the user deal with it. Add download, and you're done. Now, on to two elements that we very often use JavaScript for, that we can now just use HTML and CSS for, accordions and modals. So having an accordion on your page is often very helpful because it helps keep the page readable. Instead of showing everything at once, you can collapse everything into their titles and the user can pick which parts they want to read. There's a native pair of HTML elements that does exactly this, the details and the summary element. You can see here that by default the summary element is shown, but all the other things in the details element are hidden. And only when we click summary, all the rest is shown. Now that's great, but then the designer comes and he says, yeah, but you know, this first accordion item is actually pretty important, so that needs to be open. Sure, you add the open attribute. Now it's open. Perfect. If you're used to React or other JavaScript frameworks, you might look at this and say, okay, now it's open forever. I can click it, nothing happens because the property doesn't change. That's not great. Luckily, that's not how browsers work. Open is just the initial state. I can still click it still works. No JavaScript needed, no click handlers needed. Very easy. Okay, but then the designer comes again and he says, you know, that rectangle, no bueno, it's not good. No problem, you say. You use the marker pseudo element and you give it a different style. You can replace it with an emoji or a background image or an SVG, or you choose. And then using the open attribute, you can even switch it out for another emoji or another style. So you can even decide what your accordion looks like. If you want to move the marker to the other side, it's also fine. So one gotcha is that a summary is clickable, but like a button, it doesn't have a pointer cursor. So a user doesn't really know that something is clickable. Now for a button, for a regular button, the browser will do like a hover effect. And if you create your own buttons, they'll have a hover effect as well. Summary element doesn't have a hover effect by default. So to make things a little bit clearer, you can help the user out by highlighting it or giving it a pointer cursor. Now, using pointer cursors for things that are not links is contentious, and I'm not going to talk about it, but you choose. I just think it's very good to make sure that people know stuff is clickable. On to dialog, and I have to admit here, I'm going to cheat a little, because the dialog element does need a tiny bit of JavaScript. So the dialog element in HTML is like a better prompt or confirm. It implements a modal dialog, like the "Are you sure you want to leave the page?" But it's better. It's better because it lives inside your HTML, and it's not this weird 90s pop-up that's part of the browser that you can give it text, but that's it. You get full control over the dialog. The other nice thing is that prompts and alerts block the main JavaScript thread. Dialog doesn't, again, because it's part of your page. So you can still run JavaScript while a dialog is shown, instead of having to wait. Now, another cool thing is that the dialog takes care of all the other things that matter as well for a dialog. It makes sure that focus is kept inside the dialog so that you can't tab to parts of the page that you now can't see. It lets you add a backdrop to make sure that the dialog is nicely split from the rest of the page. And the dialog lives in a new layer called the top layer. And that means that even your chat widget with a Z index of 9 million is still behind the dialog. So you don't even need to write JavaScript to quickly hide the chat widget when you're showing a dialog, whatever. The browser takes care of it. So to create a dialog, you use the dialog element. Now, inside the dialog, there's a couple of weird things. There's a form, and we all know forms. Forms have post or maybe get, but forms now have another method called dialog. And here you can see the dialog. It's hidden by default. And to show it, you need to call show modal with a button. You have a button, an on-click handler, and you say dialog show modal. Ta-da! Now, here's where the form comes in, because okay, this is a dialogue. I've read the message. Great. What now? Well, now I want to close the dialogue again. That's what the form lets us do without, on-click handlers, etc. The form has a button. The button has a type submit, and I submit the dialog form, and the dialog closes again. Now, if you have other form data in there, you can also implement a prompt or a confirm. You can add different buttons with different values, and then when any of the submit buttons are called, you can listen to the dialog.return value to get the chosen button. So I can show the modal, get asked a question, and then you can answer, and one of them is correct, but I won't tell you which one. Now, unlike alerts, confirm, prompt, you can style this however you want. You can add rounded corners, drop shadows, whatever. It's just an HTML element, right? But you can also show a backdrop that overlays the rest of the page to, for example, dim it or even completely hide it. Now, instead of doing that manually and making sure that it covers the viewport and it doesn't scroll away, you can just style the backdrop pseudo class. And the browser will take care of it. The browser knows what the viewport is. The browser knows where to place the backdrop. You just have to tell it what it looks like. You don't have to position it. You can just add like a nice background, some blur, make it fancy. So, as I mentioned before, all of these things that I've spoken about up until now are available in browsers right now. But I also wanted to give a very, very quick overview of some of the upcoming features. Now, each of those could be a full presentation on its own, so I'm not going to go too deep into them, but I do want to show you some of the cool things that are coming like soon. Starting with masonry layout. Instead of using Packery or masonry, you can just tell the browser that this is a masonry grid, and the browser will make sure that it renders all nice with Pinterest style stacked, etc. This is currently available in Firefox if you set the right feature flag. And if you want to learn more, you can check out the Smashing Magazine article on it. Now, have you ever implemented your own select? Because if you did it wrong. I'm completely certain your custom select sucks. But the regular select also kind of sucks, because you can't really do anything with it. You can style it a little bit, but then you can't style the options. You can't position it in a different place. You can't make the options have like a nice icon or some explainer text or whatever. That's not great. So enter select menu. Select menu is a new element that has all the logic and all the semantics of a regular select. So you're not doing it wrong anymore, but you can style everything about it. If you don't do it, it looks like a regular select. I can click, I can pick an option, just works, great. But the select menu itself consists of a bunch of parts, and you can get to those with the parts pseudo class. There's a whole list of parts that I'm not going to go into, but you can have your button, you can style the list box. So you can do anything you want. You want more padding? Sure. You want rounded corners? Sure. That it just works. And you can style, you can make it a grid or whatever. However, it's very early days for this element, and it's still under development. It's behind feature flags in Chrome, and it's available in Polypaint to test with, but it's very much work in progress. This demo originally had a display grid for the list box, which gave it a grid layout. That's great, but that's also very broken at the moment. So the list box has a grid layout. You can see that it's aligned horizontally. But now, because it has a display, it's always visible. And only when I click the option, it's shown down here. So right now, it works like it should. Great. Option 3 is selected, but it moves back to the top. That's how early days it is. Now, you've probably already heard of container queries, but if not, imagine if media queries worked with random HTML elements. You could say, this HTML element is now my container, and I'm going to size and style my elements based on whatever width is available in that container. This is going to replace a ton of custom settings for your JavaScript components. But I'm not going to talk about it because Maarten van Hoof is going to talk about it later today, so go see his talk. I am quickly going to mention the parent selector, which is the thing we've wanted for at least a decade, the has selector. The has selector can replace a ton of JavaScript. It allows us for the first time to style elements not on where they are related to their parents, but where they are related to their child elements, their sibling elements, their anywhere in the DOM you can think of, you can now make your styling dependent on. In other words, it allows you to style parent elements based on their children, which is why it's very often called the parent selector. Right now, it's already available in Chrome and in WebKit. It's being worked on in Firefox, so you can't use it quite yet. You can still play with it. Now, there are hundreds of examples for this, and a ton of people are doing very exciting stuff with it. I'm not. I'm going to do something incredibly simple, but something that I'm sure all of you have implemented in the past, which is a list of options in a form, and then a person can choose other, and magically an input field appears where they can type in their other option. Now, you could add a JavaScript listener to that other, and then when it's checked, you do a display block on an input, or you can just make it dependent on the form. So I can click all these things, nothing happens, because other text is display none. But now I click other, it's now checked, and I can make it display block. It's just this little bit checks for, is the other checked? Sure, then make it display block. Pretty easy. 0 JavaScript listeners, single line of CSS, and we're good to go. Now, if you want to learn more about that, I wrote an article about where is and has that you can find at this link, polypaint.app/where-is-has. And I want to give one last example, and that's scroll-linked animations. Now, I'm not going to show any code for this because the code that's running this has already been deprecated, but it is very cool. It allows you for the first time to style the page based on how far it has scrolled. So I can scroll down, and all of this is running using CSS animations. There's no JavaScript involved. And that means you get full native scrolling, native speeds, and you still get to do a ton of very cool stuff. So the spec is currently being revised. It's going to become more powerful and less awkward to use. One of the neat things is that the current implementation that you see here only works with the page, the viewport scrolling. The new one is going to work with any scroller on the page, so you can scroll one part of the page, one element, and then have cool stuff happen elsewhere. So that's going to be very powerful, so keep your eye out for that. So those are the things you can do in modern browsers and things you will be able to do in modern browsers that no longer need JavaScript. We have a great future ahead of us once all of these features land in browsers. Now, instead of managing things with JavaScript, we can ask the browser to manage it for us based on the rules we declare with CSS and HTML, making it more resilient, faster, and hopefully more accessible. So I hope you now at least like CSS and HTML as much as me. All the live demos of upcoming features you saw are courtesy of Polypane running experimental features turned on. You can find me on Twitter as @Kilian Valkhof, and you can find Polypane at polypane.com. Thank you all for listening.